Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Charlotte Reiche, and I'm the Administrative Coordinator here on behalf of CPCA. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, the Wellbeing Through Crisis, Emotional PPE. Please note, today's session is being recorded, and you will receive access to the recording as soon as it is available. Today's staff here at CPCA are going to be Ali Boudin and Charlotte Reiche, myself. And our contact information is there for you on the screen. I'd like to walk you through how to use today's control panel. I'm sorry, my computer is being a little difficult at the morning, but due to the large audience, we will only be accepting questions through the question module in the webinar toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. We will do our best to go through as many questions and comments as possible. Our presenters will be reading some of them aloud to you today, and some of them we will be following directly in the question box. Materials are available for you in the handouts tab on the right side of your computer screen, and copies of the webinar will also be sent out in the follow-up email. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Leora, one of our presenters. Leora, you now have the floor.
Good morning. I'm going to just check, Ali and Charlotte, that you can hear me. How's my audio?
You sound great.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. As we get started, I'm going to ask Charlotte that you, just like we did last week, if you can enable us and participants to be able to see each other and us to be able to see the folks who are in conversation with us. So again, good morning. My name is Leora Wolf-Rusan. I live in Los Angeles, California, and I work for the Center for Applied Research Solutions. I'm a training specialist with the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I'm going to be sharing a little bit more about that in a second. And we're so grateful to be in continued partnership with the California Primary Care Association and also with our partner Nkem Ndefo from Lumos Transforms, who will be speaking and sharing her wisdom as a leader and her wisdom as in organizational work as we move through this moment. I want to start by saying that because we're partnering through the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, that we are funded by SAMHSA, and so the disclaimer is that while we're grateful for the funding, and while we know that SAMHSA is supporting this work, that we wanted to disclaim that it doesn't necessarily reflect the full views of the administration. So let's move forward. Again, very tiny font, but here are the main pieces to note if you are with us this morning live and also in recording. You have access to all of these no-cost technology transfer centers, which is the SAMHSA's way of saying PD, professional development, or workforce training. So the orange boxes are the mental health technology transfer centers. We're in our second year, about to move into our third year of existence. And we are the Pacific Southwest. So we serve the U.S. Pacific Islands, Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona. And we serve the mental health workforce and the school mental health workforce specifically. And we do name primary care and community clinics as in the mental health workforce, as we know that many of you are both connected to, experience, and provide formally or informally support for the full holistic wellness of those you serve. So you can access us at any time and get trainings and recordings and webinars and consultation, and that's a little bit about who we are. And our contact information is at the end. So I'm going to invite you, so as we move in today, let me just do a quick moment. This is me. I would like to say that I was hoping to be on video, but we're having a little bit of some tech barriers for you to be able to see my face. But that is my face from many years ago, but I still do look like that a little bit with slightly more gray hair. And as I mentioned, I'm a training specialist for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and I also work for the Center for Applied Research Solutions. What brings me joy and purpose and a sense of contribution is creating spaces and places for you to be held in thinking about what your practice feels like, what your organization feels like, and how to make the communities that we serve and work in feel more human in all the ways. That is the very general broad strokes of who I am. And I'm going to pass it to my colleague Nkem to unmute and say a little bit about yourself, and then we'll move into today.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Nkem Ndefo. I'm a nurse and a nurse midwife. But for the last, I would say 13 years now, I've been working in the areas of stress, trauma, and resilience, supporting frontline workers across sector, but I have a dear heart for primary care and maternal child health, especially working with vulnerable populations. And I am happy to be here today to just lend a perspective from doing sort of deep wellness work for organizations in crisis and serving communities in crisis, which is ever more apt as we are stretching into, I don't know, month what of the COVID response. All right, Leora.
Yeah. Thank you. So, I think the piece to note about the two of us is that we come from different trainings and different experiences, but we're really united in wanting to create courageous conversation and courageous discourse that become practices, policies, and programs at the organizational and systems level to support those of us who support others in that concentric circle of care. So we're going to be bouncing back and forth today, just like we did on last week's session, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about right now. So for those of you who were here with us last week, and I'm going to ask, I know that we're limited in this question box format, but I am going to ask if you are on with us live, if you can put in the questions box an asterisk if you were here with us last week on the self and collective care. And I do know some of you may have heard the recording. You may not have been with us, but you listened to the recording, which also would be a nice asterisk. Thank you, Catherine and Maria and April and Trisha. It's good to see your names again. Michelle gave an exclamation point, which maybe means I was here and it was amazing. Jennifer and Victoria, lovely. Okay, great. Keep coming. Keep doing that so that we can see how many of you were here with us last week and or heard the recording. So thank you again for being with us. And for those of you who are not, that is totally okay. We'll be able to build on it. In this session, we'll do a little bit of review, and then we'll also recommend that you join us for the recording. So thank you, Vivian, for those kind words, and Jan and Trisha. Best. Oh, thank you for that affirmation. I appreciate that. So we're moving. This has been a part of a series. We're in our last webinar of the series through our mental health TA center, and we are focusing today on well-being through emotional PPE, which some of you may have heard about or are familiar with the term, and for some of you it might be totally new. It is a term that has been kind of bridging and fostering and bubbling, especially in the last couple months. So we're going to play with it today and think about what might that look like always and now. So with that said, we are hoping today to think about what does emotional PPE look like generally, and what does it look like in 4 stages of crisis leadership. So when we think about crisis leadership, and by leadership, I want to be really clear. We're using leadership in the capital L and lowercase l. So for folks who are in organizational structural leadership positions, medical directors, CMOs, CEOs, CFOs, and we're also using the leadership in the lowercase l. So for those of you who may not have a quote-unquote formal organizational leadership role, but carry deep leadership responsibilities, practices, and offerings for your colleagues across the organization. So we'll be thinking about readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. And we're also hoping that we, through reflective questions, and most of which Nkem will be resourcing and raising, thinking about how do we identify what our leadership crisis strengths and growth points are in this moment, and also always. And then also think about 2 to 3 strategies in the short term and long term. So I know that many of you, some of you really like the theory, and thinking about broad strokes is what makes you feel joyful, and some of you like the practical, tangible, applicable. So we're hoping to find a sweet spot and balance of both. All that to say, today we'll be reviewing a little bit of self and collective care for those of you that didn't put an asterisk or exclamation point, so you don't feel like what happened, but that you're part of our conversation. We'll move into that crisis RRRR. We'll double click into emotional PPE and hear from Nkem, and then we'll close. All that the foundation is that we're hoping that from this conversation that you take only what you need. So feel no pressure to have everything integrated, just take what you need in this moment, and know that you'll get the PowerPoint, you'll have our contact information, Nkem, CPCAs, hours. So any part of your body that's like, where can I get this thing? Please know that we'll make sure that you are resourced to have the thing so that that part of your body can pause and the rest can recenter in the conversation. And that we're really offering to pay attention to whatever is resonating. And that we know that in this moment on May 26th, 2020, that while we have 90 minutes together, which can feel limited, the urgency of this moment is not. And that speaks to the now and always. So, and Kim and I will be speaking about what are the always practices of crisis readiness response, recovery and renewal, and what might be the specific now practices. And then the last is that we fundamentally believe that our learning, transformational leadership learning, happens on 3 tracks. For you as a person, you as a professional, and also you as a facilitator. We're going to offer that you try as much as possible to kind of hear this, the conversation that we're offering as you in your personal, in your own story, you as Leora, well, not you as Leora, but me as Leora. And some of you might be wanting to hear the conversation as you in your professional role, for example, me as a trainer or me as a facilitator. So just be conscious or curious about how you're hearing the learning moving forward. All that to say, I'm going to ask for us to start with a who might you thank, literally or mentally, for guiding you in this moment? It's the same question we raised in the last session, and that might be the same person or same organization or same practice, or it might be different. So I'm going to offer you in the questions box, if you would like to name who might you thank literally for guiding you in this moment, to take that time. You don't even have to explain why. It can be a person, it can be a role, it can be a practice, right? I want to name meditation, or I want to name CPCA, or I want to name my partner, or name my dog, whoever. So in the questions box, please feel free. Or if you'd like to keep it to yourself, also completely possible. Yeah, so some of us are naming spirituality, some of us are naming our family. Thank you. And my invitation is by the end of today, by the end of our session, that you might actually send a text, if possible. Some of you are naming supports that may not be possible to text, but someone who you might just be able to say, thank you for guiding me in this moment, so that we can acknowledge. Yes, so we're seeing, oh, hi, Amber, seeing Brene Brown, we're seeing coworkers, we're seeing organizations like the CPCA, LAC, and colleagues, and spiritual frameworks. Thank you. And one last piece so that we can ground and orient and connect, I'm going to hand it to Nkem, and then we'll get rocking and rolling after Nkem grounds us, or helps us ground.
So actually we're going to do, I find that with the increase in people working virtually, that and the request for social distancing, that many of us are in responding to COVID are in a lot of stress. And in stress, we tend to disconnect from ourselves, which is not the best place for learning. So I'm going to do a little practice here to help you come into connection with this moment which will hopefully make it a bit easier to connect together here and that we can learn alongside each other. So this is completely invitational. Wherever you are, if you could at this moment start to tune your senses to the environment around you. Noticing, first, what are you hearing? What are the sounds around you? You're probably hearing sounds in my environment. I'm in Los Angeles, Tongaland. You can hear the LAPD helicopter. What are you seeing, turning on your vision? What kind of objects or colors or what's in your environment? Looking around, connecting. Even the temperature, the air on your skin, your clothing hitting your body, really connecting to this current moment. And it would be great if you have the inclination is to type in the question box where you're located, right? Where are you located and what are you experiencing in your environment? And I find this is a lovely way to connect to each other across space and time and to ready ourselves to learn together. It would be great. I see sound from the TV, Jane green from the backyard, sunlight around, the windows all open. So as you all type this in, we've got Jacksonville in the house and there's too much rain. Just notice, even as the questions are coming in Richland, Washington, birds chirping, Los Molinos from my nursing office in South LA, somebody's in Washington, D.C. with cats sleeping, Kimberly. So just recognizing that we're people first in our locations and that we can connect together and learn together. Sunlight and 86 degrees for Tricia. And in Pittsburgh, surprisingly, it's not raining for Victoria. So I'm going to keep reading through those. I hope you all can see them. And I'm going to hand it back to Leora so that we can jump into this content ready to, again, learn alongside each other.
Thanks, Nkem. I hear my fan and I see the sunlight of Los Angeles, and I also feel now even more ready to share with all of you, particularly because I feel very connected for kind of imagining all of you together in one room, which would have been my dream to be able to be in person with you. And I know that you can't see the responses. So we will definitely try and read them out loud as much as possible. Thank you, Dale, for mentioning that. Okay, so we're going to transition into getting really clear about what and why we're talking about. Definitions, terminology, naming, particularly for those of you who were with us 2 weeks ago or were not with us 2 weeks ago or whenever the last session was on the 19th, so that we can get clear about what we're talking about. Particularly because we believe that foundationally part about being trauma-informed and healing-centered as an organization and practice is really being explicit and clear about why we're using the language we're using, because language is an externalized representation of our internalized belief system. So I want to start with this concept of well-being, and we're using, because this title is talking about emotional PPE through our well-being. And so let's actually even take a moment to question and kind of problematize what does well-being even mean, right? And so Diener and Seligman, so Seligman you may be familiar with, who's one of the main writers about well-being, says that well-being is people's positive evaluations of their lives, which includes emotion, engagement, satisfaction, and meaning, right? And that there's three main outputs and inputs. That's the interesting part about well-being. It's dynamic. It's not just something we produce or create, but it's also something that we experience and are actively involved in. And so well-being is this kind of bubbling soup of three ingredients: our social support and relationships that are meaningful and not harmful, but are meaningful. And that we have relationships and access and navigational capital, meaning we know what questions to ask, we know the system, we're familiar, we feel like we have power and efficacy in navigating our health professionals. And that can mean a whole bunch of things, right? It can mean our physical health professionals, behavioral health professionals, cultural healers, any way that you're understanding the word health professionals. And then the middle, which is bolded here on the screen because that's the piece that we're going to be spending a lot of time with, is finding a sense of meaning. And so our well-being is deeply connected to the stories, the worldview, the way that we create a narrative about what's happening with us, for us, and by us. That relates deeply to how we lifted up the conversation around self and collective care in our last session. And I hope that one of you, I can't remember who it was, so forgive me, and you can let me know in the questions box. One of you at the very end said, okay, but what is collective care? And I realized that I had been talking about creating definitions the whole time, and then we actually didn't name explicitly on the screen about what self and collective care is. So a very quick reminder that self-care refers to the person in the system, in the ecosystem, so that we're all bounded by our families and our communities, our social relationships, and our social structure, and our dominant culture. So the person nested in that ecosystem, and the idea that that person within an ecosystem has access to develop regulation tools, which we just kind of experienced, we did experience a little toe dip in with Nkem just now, self-reflection skills and attunement, which you can kind of think about old school antennas on top of the TV, trying to find the connection so the sound can come in clearly. So attunement is us kind of antennaing into our own selves, our own needs, and take action for your needs to be communicated, met, and heard. So we are not naming self-care, in the words of Francois Mathieu, as kale and pedicures. We're naming self-care as really rigorous work because it requires us to be tuned in to what we're experiencing, what's coming in, and also how we're communicating out. Collective care is that ecosystem. It is care provided across the system that the dominant culture, so our belief systems, our language, our values, center interdependency, right? My worth is connected to your worth, and your worth is connected to mine. And interconnectivity, the structures, practices, and policies that create workplace climates that promote wellness equally and equitably. I'm going to say those two things again, for all, and also attuned to deep need and who is harmed and who's benefited by policies and practices. Safety, significant relationships, and reflection are organizational cornerstones. So that is our definition of self and collective care, and you're going to see this come up in our conversation around emotional PPE and well-being throughout the rest of our session together. And I want to name that we are really clear that it is not one or the other. They are connected. Self-care is always in conversation with collective care, and collective care is always in conversation with self-care. And so we are on the soapbox of let's all stop saying just self-care. Let's actually start saying self and collective to get really clear about how the person and the ecosystem are in constant conversation with each other. So all that said, one last review point, which is that many of you may be familiar with these trauma-informed principles. So this is the way, these are principles, the values and actions that an organization and leaders and an organization can commit to, can be conscious of, can be attuned into, that everything is based upon these principles. And these principles reflect both what we need in order to feel well, in order to access our well-being, and what we need in order to heal. So it is a wraparound. It is the readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. These principles are the undercurrent of everything. That both empowerment helps us, sorry, that is my doorbell that you all just heard. Empowerment helps us respond and prepare for when we're feeling crisis, and empowerment also helps us heal from when we're feeling crisis. And we're going to talk about these principles as we move through the day. So as we move through the session. Okay. Great. And I just wanted to, offer you in the question box, if you wanted to just name one trauma-informed principle that you are experiencing well right now. Like if you wanted to give my workplace, my team, my organization is doing this very well. what would it look like? So your choices are collaboration, empowerment, humility, safety, trustworthiness, and peer support. So what are you experiencing on your team? What are you experiencing at your workplace well right now? And I'm going to look into the question box to see what comes up for you. Okay, so we have, Tom. Oh, hi, Tom. Peer support. Tom is receiving, but I'm also imagining, because I know who Tom is, that he is providing lots of peer support for educators in Long Beach. Thank you. Kimberly is experiencing safety and peer support. Great. Let's see what else. Collaboration. Carol is reflecting all, and Gina is also saying staff supporting each other. So lots of peer support and collaboration right now. And I just wanted to note what a kind of how that is patterned in who is turned and tuned into this conversation. Like, just look at how much peer support and safety is coming up in this moment. And Kendall, hi Kendall, it's good to see you. Kendall is saying, what if we're 0 for 6? And my imagination is that at the organizational level, you may be experiencing kind of the emptiness of not feeling any of these principles being lifted up. And so if that was the case, my question, if we were in person, would be, what is your need in this moment out of all 6 for you to feel safe in your organization, for your own regulation and attunement, so you can refocus back on yourself? Thank you. Okay. So we're gonna transition into readiness, crisis readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. And I do want to just flag, as Nkem will be speaking later, that these are some great questions also, Nkem, for you to speak to or bring up in practice of how to bring trauma-informed principles in the now and always. And what is so lovely about what just happened is I just also got a scan that many of you are in school systems. So I want to name that the crisis readiness, response, recovery, and renewal, while the conversation in the next couple paragraphs will be focused a little bit on healthcare, more on healthcare crisis leadership, because we're partnering with the California Primary Care Association. We also know that our patients and who we serve are deeply connected to school communities. So there will be a lot of ability to translate and transfer the conversation back and forth between settings. All right, so the main question is, how do we show up for each other in this moment? So that's the question that I'm hoping you sit with and kind of live in as I move through the next couple chapters. And I'm going to ask Nkem also, as you see questions come up, Nkem, if you might respond to them as I'm going through the next couple slides. So please feel free, for those of you on the line, please feel free to put your questions in the chat box, because we want to make sure that, that you also feel heard in this. All right. So before, again, we move into the RRRRs, I want to offer you this definition for healthcare crisis leadership. And this is based on Marshall Gantz, who's a Harvard professor who writes a lot about community organizing and leadership through crisis. It's also based on our center's upcoming School Mental Health Leadership Crisis Readiness Response Referral and Recovery Guide, and that will be coming up, Renewal Guide, and that will be coming up in a little bit. I'm going to read out the definition and then invite you to listen to what parts of the definition resonate with you. So health crisis leadership. The individual, collective, organizational, and systemic skills, knowledge, and competencies based on awareness and acceptance of the responsibility and accountability to create work conditions, climates, and cultures that empower others to navigate uncertainty and harm so that all patients, staff, and partners can repair, regulate, and restore. I'm going to read that one more time. The individual, collective, organizational, and systemic skills, knowledge, competencies based on awareness and acceptance of the responsibility and accountability to create work conditions, climates, and cultures that empower others to navigate uncertainty and harm so that all patients, staff, and partners can repair, regulate, and restore. That is our definition that we're offering as we move forward, and you might have your own definition, and that is also a wonderful takeaway from this conversation, is bringing back to your team when there is space for it to think about how do you define crisis leadership on your team, in your department, in your agency, and how might that definition name the things that you need to get better about and name the things that you want to affirm and acknowledge. So if that is our definition, we are going to kind of double click into how do we get ready for a thing. And I'm naming crises as big things. Crises can feel traumatic. They might be a trauma. They might be an event. They might be an experience. They might be a natural disaster. Crises are things that overwhelm our individual and collective coping systems, right? So we think about crisis leadership in 4 ways: in readiness, response, recovery, and renewal. And I'm going to go through each 4 R's, and then we're going to turn back into the emotional PPE conversation. So there's a couple. This is chapter 1, and then we'll move into chapter 2 on emotional PPE. So here we go. We're going to start with readiness. And I want to be really, really clear that I know that some of you might have a hard time thinking about readiness because we're actually in response mode. Some of you might have more space to think about readiness, and that's great too. So the time frame of readiness is thinking about what past things have we gone through that we can learn from, what present skills, knowledge, and competencies do we need to amp up or leverage, and what might we predict in the future to be coming that we need to get ready for. So the competencies, some of the readiness competencies might look like building the competencies of everyone. So human relations, accounting, behavioral health, nurses, doctors. And again, if you're not part of a healthcare clinic or healthcare agency, you can translate that into who is every stakeholder part of or champion part of a community. What are the competencies that everyone needs to get grounded in? And so some of those we kind of gave some ideas. You might have your own, and I very much encourage you to put in the questions box your own. But for example, psychological first aid, or trauma-informed and resilience-oriented awareness, or disaster preparation. What are the competencies that everyone in the ecosystem should know? We also focus in readiness on collaboration. So partnerships are essential here. What partnerships can you build, foster, contribute to in the readiness stage? So we gave some examples here too: faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, philanthropy, so a lot of first sector partners, peer-led, not peer-ed, but peer-led groups. So many folks who are specialized in peer support and recovery, or in school communities. So what does that readiness look like? It looks like strengthening partnerships, and that can either mean informally or formally through MOUs. And then the last C is communication. So how might in the readiness stage, pre-crisis, we develop communication protocols, we think about our connection and language norms, which is what I've been talking about. How do we even define crisis? What does crisis look like for different members of our community across intersectionality? And then we also think about how do we create low-impact disclosure, which Nkem will be talking about in a little bit, and also reflective supervision practices. And you'll notice that a lot of the elements in the readiness comes up when we talk about the self and collective care practices, because usually those are the bedrock of creating an organization or community or a team that's ready to buffer a big thing happening. Okay. So we're going to move from readiness, and I'm going to move into response. So I just want to name again, like many of us are in response, and so some of this might really resonate, and I'm going to encourage you in the question box to also add your own response and what you're learning in this moment of what has been necessary in leadership during crisis. The time frame of response leadership is the present, right? It's the moment right in front of us. That is the response. It's the triage moment right in front of us. And the focus of the response phase is to protect and reduce unnecessary or undue stress. That is really critical. unnecessary and undue stress. So we're not exacerbating the wound. We are tending to the wound. We're also focused on meeting basic needs and on fostering that connection and interdependence, right? That this is very common for us in crisis mode to think that we are the only person who can solve the problem, or that all the power is nested in the responsibility of those, quote unquote, at the top. And a crisis leader sees deeply that we can't do this work alone, that we can never do response work alone. A crisis leader also identifies and responds to tipping points. So what are the events in the now and in the very short-term future that would either increase or decrease the fear or a risk that might put both the folks who are serving, so in this case frontline and essential workers, although maybe Nkem can talk about this, but I always struggle with the term essential workers because I think we're all essential. But what might we identify as tipping points? So in California analogy, that might think about potential aftershocks, right, after an earthquake, what might come very quickly that could also increase or decrease fear risk. And in the response phase, we think about mitigation of panic and disruption, and sometimes that comes through communication in the readiness, as in the readiness phase, but also in deep coordination and counteraction with firm compassion. So another way to think about that is a leader is a warm demander. A leader is someone who, with firmness, but also with compassion, says, this is what we are doing and this is what we're not doing. This is who we are and this is who we are not. This is what we will stand for and who we will stand for, and this is what we will not stand for or not align with. And you'll see on the screen that we also put that speaks to misinformation, that speaks to we are not going to contribute and exacerbate racism and stigma. Many of us are deeply aware because of our personal and professional experiences that this moment has really, again, allowed for structural violence and racism to activate in the relationship of COVID-19 in many, many ways, and potentially Nkem might speak a little bit about that later. And then the last piece is that the response phase is really focused on fatality management. What that can look like, and a lot of this comes from Trauma Transformed in the Bay Area, our colleagues, that fatality management is kind of a tricky term. So many of you might come up with maybe a better way to name this. But fatality management in the response phase is thinking about how do we set up grief circles, faith-based support, a response for fatalities, and a response to professionals' hyper-exposure to painful loss. And I want to name that this is actually the piece that is the least, that we have kind of the least coordinated or written down knowledge about. And it's also where many of us who might need to do deep listening into what is the organic way that people are showing up and creating fatality management that our organizations and systems were not built or ready for. And so you'll see that all of the pieces that we were getting ready for in the previous phase are actuated and enacted in the response phase. And so I just want to make sure that I am seeing, yes, we'll talk about a little bit about psychological first aid, Renata, thank you, as we move forward in emotional PPE, thank you. I want to make sure that I'm able to respond to the questions too. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so this is in the response phase. And again, we're focusing the conversation on leadership. So this is both the capital L and the lowercase l of what does this work look like in this moment. So I'm going to move forward into recovery, and then we'll be able to, and thank you, Nkem, for answering questions in the chat, and then we'll be able to think about the next two phases. So I want to be clear that many of us in emergency management, in disaster management, and also just what's out there in the work, that the readiness and response phases are really resourced. There's a lot of content, guides, tip sheets, toolkits, trainings on readiness and response. The next two R's are less discussed and we believe most important from an equity standpoint. So all the R's are important, but the next two R's really hold deep place, particularly because they ask for leaders to step into places of even more vulnerability. Usually readiness and response is about management, which is about answers. And the recovery and renewal phases is about leadership, which is about questions. And as many of you have heard, a lot of folks bring up in the last couple weeks that that vulnerability, this practice of vulnerability, is deeply connected to the Latin root of wound, of really being able and open as a leader to reflect the wounds of those you serve, and also be in touch with your own relationship to being open and to being exposed, and thinking about ways for you to be guided and purposed in your wounds, but not potentially overwhelmed by it. So we're going to move into recovery and response, and I want to again reflect that some of you might just be in, recovery and renewal, and I want to be reflective that some of you might just stay here in kind of your thinking about what leadership movement you need, and may not be ready to think about recovery and renewal, and some of you actually might be in doing the recovery work and have the space to plan for renewal. So all is good. All right. So recovery, we are grateful when we think about, when I think about the question at the beginning of our time together of who's guiding you in this moment, Judith Herman from Trauma and Recovery, her cornerstone canonic book, is a teacher of mine who is guiding me through this moment. And she offers us that recovery is really, can be thought about in three ways: in safety, remembrance, and reconnection. And I'm going to go through those in a little bit. Recovery is the week or month or year after a big thing. And the assumption here is that the crisis was a one-time event, and we know that's not true. We know that crises are layered and complicated and compounded. So it may be a big collective experience like we're all feeling right now, and that because of the many different intersections with crises, that some of us might be able to think of this as a one-time event, and some of us really experience this as a complicated issue that it brings up multiple crises in one. So this idea is that recovery is, in the leadership frame, it's focused on the past and the present. What happened and what is happening, right? Recovery is on the past and the present. The main ideas as a leader in recovery is to think about connectedness, and commonality. So finding the peer support and resonance institutionally and organizationally. And how wonderful that many of you named that you're feeling peer support as one of the central trauma-informed principles in this moment. And so you might be experiencing some kind of italicized, soft recovery even in this moment, when we're in response. And so, again, the recovery modality of connectedness and commonality most comes through safety. So how do you empower the survivors? How do you restore a sense of control? Of remembrance and mourning, so commemoration, memorialization. And we all in this last weekend saw visually and through a lot of social media and conversation through the New York Times front page around remembrance and mourning, and what does this look like to hold space for all the lives that we have lost and also the lives that we will lose. And this is the last piece that's sometimes the hardest, is the reconnection with ordinary life. So that might look like regulation and stabilization and reorientation. So in the recovery, it is that kind of collective exhale. How do we reconnect with quote-unquote ordinary life, even though I want to be clear that nothing after crisis is ever ordinary. It just feels less in our sympathetic nervous system, and maybe more with equanimity between our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. So in thinking about recovery in our leadership frame, and we're going to get to the last one and then move into how we do this, how does this show up in kind of emotional PPE work, that in recovery, whether or not you're in a healthcare clinic, whether or not you're at a school, whether you're at a community-based organization, that that kind of 3 pillars of recovery, safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection are really foundational. And many of us might think about, where do we feel most efficacious and most grounded and most competent in our own training and leadership? And actually, if we then identify, I actually really don't know a lot about how to lead people through remembrance and mourning, but that might inform the conversations in our readiness phase of what partners might we need to turn to and what work might we need to do to get there. So that is my invitation for reflection, is for you to think about which pieces are you finding more fluency with, and which pieces might you need support with in order to guide your team, your organization, and yourself through recovery. Okay. Last but not least is renewal. And this R, everyone, is the R that I kind of decided on, and T2 thankfully said, yeah, like we'll call it renewal. So you may have a different R name, but maybe restoration, renewal, but this idea of renewal is that this is the long-term work. This is a year after a big thing, or 3 years after a big thing, or 5 years after a big thing. It's this idea of that we create a constructive and coherent story of the self, right? What happened to us, with us, or by us. And it is focusing on the now and then also on the future. Where do we go from here? That's the renewal work. It's not what was the silver lining in the crisis. We actually don't think about it that way. We think about, like, what was the story, and putting pieces together, because as we know, crisis and trauma can oftentimes freeze or disrupt our building of the story of ourselves and of our organizations and of our communities and of our cultures and societies. So we want to put those pieces back together by naming what happened, navigating through what happened, and then normalizing what happened. Again, not to say that if something happened that was incredibly harmful, we're not normalizing the harm. We're not saying that that folks who were harmed by through structural oppression or through a big event that was really violent, that's not normal and should never be normal, but we're normalizing all of the different responses and reactions that happened in the organization so that we can then move forward. Renewal is deeply about thinking about the root causes and meaning making so that we can get to that repair, to that healing. And it's that creation of time to feel celebratory about our ability to safely reconnect. And many of us might be kind of eager for that, and some of us may not be ready for that in this moment. And then the last is really critical. In the renewal phase, we reimagine. We reimagine systems and services, and then we learn from the lessons and the data that surfaced through the response and through the recovery. It's deep listening work. And reimagining is not, again, in this response mode. It's not in the what do we need to do right now, but it's actually in this when you have the space to think about what learnings and data surfaced during a crisis that we want to interrupt, dismantle, and actually not have in place in order to prevent future harm. Okay. That was a lot of the R's. I'm going to ask for a moment for you in the questions box, to take one takeaway or aha from those 4 R's of what's resonating. So one takeaway in all of those 4 R's, in the readiness, in the response, in the recovery, and the renewal, that's resonating with you right now. What's your one thing that you would like to remember from our last 10 minutes together? And I'm going to look for you to put those thoughts in the comment box. Yeah, so Carol is naming the one takeaway is the connection with others as foundational throughout all of the 4 R's, right, Carol? Yes. And I'm going to, yes, great. Let's see some others. One aha or takeaway. Trisha is naming we are really stronger together. Yep, so we're seeing the power of collective care through crisis. Lisa is naming that it's good to know we'll be able to look back and tell the story of this. Yeah, and Lisa, I just want to name that our bodies, our literal, the architecture of our bodies are wired for that, want us to do that, need us to do that. So if we can do that as organizations, how even more powerful. Todd is naming the importance of collaboration. Claudia is also one of Claudia's takeaways is the interaction with coworkers. And maybe, Claudia, you can give one more sentence about that, of what that feels for you. And then Naomi is also naming the desire to focus on renewal. And thank you, Naomi. Yes, it's hard when we've been through 4 disasters in 3 years and that we're losing faith in renewal, how to walk through this with people. Yeah, so my response, and Nkem and I can talk a little bit about this later, is that if you are constantly in response phase, it is very hard to move into renewal. And so part of what I would offer is to actually not push yourselves necessarily to move into renewal if the context that you're working in is asking you to be in chronic and consistent triage, right? Many of us know, particularly if we think about emergency medicine or if we think about folks who are constantly and chronically experiencing big things, that asking them to slow down and reflect on what they're experiencing for their own humanity can actually be really painful and not helpful at all, because if they pause or if they slow down, then everything comes up that may not be willing or ready to surface. And so we want to be really intentional and explicit about when we move into renewal phase, and that also, as I hopefully said earlier, but I'm going to repeat in case I didn't, that all of this is subjective, that we as an organization, our organizational leaders might say, okay, now we're in recovery mode, but we might have employees and staff who are still in response and some who might be ready into renewal. And so as leaders, we want to hold the container for all. We want to normalize that it's okay to be exactly where you are all the time, and to create organizational structures, as we're going to move into when we talk about emotional PPE, that can most buoy and buffer folks from experiencing exacerbated harm. So I'm going to read out a couple more and then move forward. So Magdalena is saying that there can be calm in the crisis through future-oriented planning, and that it creates a sense of survival. Yes, so even thinking about that, actually, again, if we think about that trauma-informed principle of empowerment, it can help us feel steady when things do not feel steady, right? If trauma or crisis is something that's happening to us, we might think of this work of planning as something that happens with us, which can help us regulate. And Renata is also naming the appreciation to allow for fatality management and to allow for grief, deep grief leadership, grief sensitivity, grief attunement in this time, now and always. Jane is lifting up the understanding and the application of how to humanize this experience that will help Jane in the 4 R's. And then, again, we're seeing the importance of remembrance and mourning. So Maria might go and buy Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, because that's a big takeaway from Maria. Jessica is naming the importance of connectedness and sharing how we feel. And also how we support and repair the leaders. Yes, thank you, April. Those exposed to hyper loss. Nkem will be able, Nkem, I'm giving you a big to-do list, but Nkem will be able to speak to that later. And that also we're thinking about wise response versus reaction. Thank you. So I'm just actually going to take a moment, Todd, there, because Todd is saying, why are you naming the 3rd stage response versus reaction? And again, it's actually exactly because of what you just put, right? That response is intentional and deliberate. And reaction, it can be, I just snapped my fingers if you didn't hear, it can be knee-jerk. And so we actually want, even though response, the time is present and in the now, we want the work and the leadership, policies, practices, and any action that is taken to be intentional. You can still be intentional even when you are experiencing and navigating crisis. And particularly it is do no harm, to mitigate harm, and to make sure that we're not reacting and exacerbating harm in that response phase. So I hope that that helps, Todd, and I can speak a little bit more about that in a second. Okay, and Dale lastly is saying we can access some of the recovery even if we're not there yet. Beautiful. And the renewal even if you're not there yet, right? So none of those 4 R's are necessarily, they're not actually, what is the term I'm thinking of? Help me out, everyone. They are not exclusive. They are all playing in conversation with each other. Thank you. Okay. We're going to move into emotional PPE. So we're transitioning. You just heard me take a breath in. That's marking the transition. And then we'll get to think about what this might look like for ourselves. So I'm going to offer you, as we think about emotional PPE, that I'm going to offer you to think about emotional PPE again as the wraparound, the whole container of all 4 R's. Right? It is what we can work on and get ready with. It is what will enable our response to be intentional and to be equitable, per what Todd just named. It is what will help us in the recovery and will guide us through the renewal. So it is the always and the now. So if we think about emotional PPE, we think about it, again, like I just said, before, during, and after a crisis. And one way to think about what the definition of emotional PPE is to manage emotional like the spread of emotional toxicity or emotional dysregulation or pain or undue suffering in healthcare. And we can think about that, of course, in all the other contexts that we work in if we're not working specifically in healthcare. And of course, as we've talked about as a society in the last 3 months, we've heard PPE as the gown or the mask or the goggles or the gloves. And so our question in the next couple of minutes is, what are the kind of analogies of the physical PPE to the emotional PPE? And as I move through this, I'm going to ask Nkem again to help me in the questions box, so I can help guide us through, and then I'll turn to the questions box when Nkem when you share. Okay. So this might look familiar to many of you because this is a similar image that we looked at when we talked about self and collective care. What are the barriers to self and collective care and the enablers? So I'm really being clear that there are analogies and symmetry and symbiosis between what helps us enable our self and collective care with this emotional work. And on the left-hand side, you'll see that we put ideas like the workload or stigma or toxicity, the onus of being able to have to take care of our own personal or take care of ourselves rather than be held by the system, the lack of resources and personnel, the feeling of overextension, and the absence of peer support and supervision. So these are all barriers. And we know this because the opposite is what helps us enable into that emotional PPE, that enable into the personal protective equipment, which, again, might look like boundaries as a personal protective equipment, as leadership and modeling, as low-impact disclosure, also sometimes known as healthy debriefing. Some of you asked about that psychological first aid training, that getting attuned into understanding what folks need during crisis and providing psychological first aid as protective personal equipment collectively and organizationally. And so this was our reminder list, and you'll see how many connections there are with the definition of well-being that we started and the definition of self and collective care, and then as we moved through the 4 R's. So my invitation to those of you on the line is to take this slide and add your own on the left, add your own on the right, and it could potentially be a conversation starter when appropriate and safe with folks that you work with. So it could potentially be a conversation starter as a way to think about how you might build readiness and what you have needed in this moment in response. Okay. So this is a time for our questions box, and I want to be really, Lisa already got there in the questions box. Okay, great. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see an image of one person's kind of metaphor, or bringing out this metaphor of what emotional protective and personal protective equipment might look like: gown, gloves, mask, booties, and goggles. So I just want to note, and Nkem and I talked about this earlier, we don't necessarily agree with all of these translations. In fact, I might even argue with some of these translations. But I wanted to show you an image of what it could look like to name the personal protective equipment that's physical, that our culture and our society is now talking about and identifying, and then thinking about what is the emotional translation. So again, the content on the right is not necessarily what we want to promote or agree with, but I wanted to show you an analogy. So I'm going to ask in the chat box if you might actually come up with your own analogy. So what is your own emotional PPE mask? What are your own emotional PPE booties? What are your own emotional PPE gloves and gowns? And in the same way that we say that self-care is not just about what we put on the self, but we also have the organization be responsible and the whole ecosystem responsible in collective care, that exact same analogy might stand. So what do we need to be provided with, by the organization in order to access it at the person? So PPE stands for personal protective equipment, but that personal protective equipment is also sourced and provided or not provided by our organization and our culture. So I'm going to offer for you to think about what some of that analogies might feel like as we move through the next chapter of this conversation. And Lisa already got us there thinking about wearing a face covering so that Lisa doesn't spread anxiety or stress to others through language and words and communication. And the only offering, Lisa, that I would say is that just like a face covering, it prevents only so much, and still some of the face is a way that we communicate with others. And so in this moment, we can try to not spread anxiety or undue stress, but we can also say it's okay to feel anxiety and stress because that is what this moment is causing. So I'm going to invite you to normalize and name even your own expectations for yourself. Okay. A couple other pieces, and then we'll get to hear what this looks like in practice. So for those of you who are involved in school mental health, you know that we all love our triangles so much, the universal, targeted, and intensive. And so this is a little bit of a play on that, thinking about what are the policies and practices that we all can embody and embrace when we think about emotional, protective, personal equipment. What kinds of emotional PPE might certain roles have more responsibility for? And then what kind of emotional PPE might some team members need more intensively? And that's thinking from a justice lens, that's thinking from an equity lens, that's thinking from an organizational lens about who has been in and who will be in higher exposure, and who do we make less safe than others. So I'm going to give a couple examples about what that looks like moving forward. So these are all questions thinking about our collective well-being through crisis, during crisis, and after crisis. Okay, lots of text on this visual, so this might be a take-home visual. But I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to start with all. And the bottom is going to think about what are the policies and practices that we all can embody and embrace. So that is reception, that is behavioral health, that is the chief medical director, that is every single person in the community, the patients themselves, and that is deeply connected to the self and collective cultural factors that sustain us and prepare us and connect us. The same things that we've been talking about in our last session and this session. Some of that might look like reflective supervision. So that, and I gave everyone resources at the end in case you are interested in learning more. Reflective supervision looks like having someone sit in curiosity and being trained in how to ask questions that really understand that you, as the employee, have the answers to your own problems, and a reflective supervisor is trained in asking cognitive coaching questions that guide you to your own answers. So it's very strengths-based. And again, we think about what are the cultural practices that connect us through that connect us congenially. So that we know about our colleagues' nephew's graduation, we compliment them on the food that they made, we say happy birthday, we recognize each other, and that we also connect collegially, where we're able to really name and lift up ideas and practices and talk about the work. So some of us work in workplaces where we're only able to talk about the genial, the people, and not the work. And some of us are only able to talk about the work, the legion, the collegiality, and not the people. We want to do both. I'm going to move into the sum and then a few. So in the sum, we think about what kind of emotional PPE might certain roles have more responsibility for. And so I want to name that this is a really great place to lift up the partnerships that you've been cultivating or might cultivate in the readiness phase now and always. And this actually is in honor of one of you, I hope that you are on with us, who wrote this really beautiful reflection in our last session that oftentimes in healthcare clinics that behavioral health is seen as the default emotional support system for everyone in the workplace. And I would say the same for schools, right? The same as the school counselor or the school psych. That's not always appropriate, and it's not always supportive or healthy for an organization. So we want to think about that behavioral health, that all of us are not, I think the quote was, are not inoculated. I think I'm saying that right, and Nkem will correct me, innocuous to pain and suffering. Even though you're trained, and I'm speaking this for myself, I spend a lot of time in the grief and trauma and death space, and I deeply experience grief and trauma and death that I am not always able to resource my colleagues, even though I have content knowledge and experience knowledge. And so it's a really great place to think intentionally about what partners you might tap into to support peer recovery. And this also is deeply embedded in the responsibility of, can be deeply embedded in the responsibility of human relations, which sometimes is more, we call in more for liability, but we could actually reframe pretty radically and think about HR as a platform for emotional PPE. Whoa, what would that look like? And that many of these responsibilities, particularly from the policy and the cultural stance, really sit in the lap of those who are in that capital L leadership role, in the CMO, CEO, or medical director role. So I want you to note that in the visual there's the bolded question other, because again, these are conversation starters. Many of you have way more answers than I do, and so I'm inviting you to use this frame if it's helpful, and you might have other pieces to put into the all, some, and then lastly a few, which is thinking about what kind of emotional PPE might some team members need more intensively. And that might look like actually providing complex or competitive grief or trauma therapy to team members in the recovery and the renewal phase. That might look like thinking about direct interventions for team members who might have a history of historic or past trauma that might be activated by the present. And as I mentioned earlier, this may not always be best provided internally because of safety. We want to create a space where the workplace can feel safe and not feel hyper exposed and unsafely vulnerable for folks to get the support. So again, I know, and Nkem has reminded me of this many times, that in the healthcare in healthcare environments, this conversation around emotional PPE may not be culturally connected. Like some of us might be like, work is for work and outside of work is for outside of work. And in this moment, we know that there's a lot of blur and a compression where work is kind of being the main platform for all the things to happen. So we want to think about how might we provide policies and practices for all, responses for some, and then deep intentional interventions for a few that we plan for in the readiness, that we provide for in the recovery. So each stage has also a different role. Okay. I am going to pause and one more time actually invite, I'm going to invite you to just sit with this question. We don't necessarily, I really want to value Nkem's time, so I'm going to ask us that you take this question home with you in thinking about what emotional PPE practices do you have in place for all, do you have in place for some, and do you have in place for a few, and then what from our suggestions might you add or drop or change to make your own? And I want to be really clear that that conversation doesn't happen just on your own. That conversation has to happen with multiple stakeholders from multiple voices and perspectives. All that to say, I'm going to toss it to Nkem, who will share, I think, a lot of what's come up in the chat box and also what this can look like in practice.
Thank you, Leora. I've had notes prepared, but I want to be responsive to the questions here and the themes that are coming up. And I want to address the questions first. Like the most explicit questions was, what suggestions do you have for those denying that there are any issues? Yet the behaviors say otherwise. Say, John Wayne, we're in the rural. And I believe this was Todd who asked this question. I firmly believe, and this is through my experience in working with a lot of organizations, is everyone's doing the best they can. And if somebody can't admit that it's a problem, often it's because it's such a big problem. And we can't force them to see something that they're not ready to see. I think we can all admit in our own histories there were things about, that we couldn't see until we were able to see them. And so with a lens towards compassion and recognize what they're telling us is they're showing with their behavior that they're beyond their limits, and they're telling us, I can't talk about a problem because I'll completely fall apart. And so instead, the goal is to resource people. And when you can resource them and they start to have a little more spaciousness, then they can say, okay, yeah, that was the problem. And that little bit of space gives them distance within which to work. And I find in healthcare, prior to the pandemic, most of us were operating pretty much at our limit capacity, if not beyond our capacity. There wasn't a lot of breathing room. And so when you add the COVID response, people really, truly, not just in the healthcare setting, but also personally, are just stretched. And so it's not a surprise to see this. And I think meeting it with compassion has been the most useful strategy that I see from an organizational and even an interpersonal perspective. Todd, you can let me know if that answered that for you. I'll keep an eye on the question box. And I want to directly address Renata's question, which is, what is low-impact disclosure? So oftentimes when something has happened or is happening that's intense, we have the impulse to share the intensity in the storytelling. And so, as a healthcare provider, I think we can say, like, gallows humor. We can talk about some of our worst case scenarios, and we kind of laugh about them. But when we describe it, we tend to describe it to each other in a blow-by-blow detail. And then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Okay, that's high-impact disclosure. And what it actually does, it's harmful for the storyteller, because the storyteller, in telling it, is typically reliving it. And often it's a traumatic story, and so you're actually re-entrenching the experience, okay? You feel like you're getting it out, but you're re-experiencing it. And just in the limits of time we have, I can't get into the science behind that, but suffice it to say there is. And then the people hearing it are also now experiencing it vicariously with you. And truthfully, what do you need in the sharing? What do you need in the sharing? You need to be witnessed in that this was hard, right? Whether this happened, unless you're getting like supervision on, like, should I have made this clinical decision or this administrative or this decision, other than that, you really just want to be witnessed by a colleague. And so really it's more low-impact disclosure is to share how it was for you, not the blow-by-blow. So, like, this was really hard. I felt blah, blah, blah. It was really intense for me at this moment. And so that helps in peer groups, in staff meetings. It helps prevent even casual conversation, just setting the tone for low-impact disclosure, prevents excessive vicarious traumatization. Okay, so what I want to translate that into is I find in working, even the word emotional can be very charged for many people. You know, part of taking care of business and acting is to not be feeling, right? Like, I need to move, I need to do something. Our stress responses are to protect and to perform, and are not really about, you know, spending time or having space to feel. And that's what we're asked to do as in healthcare, is to perform, to protect. And so it's a little difficult to ask us culturally about the feeling piece. And so I find I work cross-sector, but so this would apply also, and I know we're talking to some folks from school communities about the idea of it's often safer to talk about the body response, meaning how stress shows up in your body, the tension, the difficult sleep, this kind of thing, than the emotions. That's often a safer place for people to disclose and makes for an easier conversation. And from what we know about how the way stress works, that those responses are actually primarily biological in the body first, and then move to the emotions, and then move to the thoughts. It's in that order, from the bottom up. And so it's not only more culturally acceptable to talk about the body stressors, but it also actually will get you closer to the root for moving things through. So I want to put that there. And if you have any other questions, please pop them in there, and Leora and myself will keep our eye on that box here. Because this idea of the stress and defense response is coming from the body, there's often an impulse in our culture here to use behavioral and cognitive strategies to control stress responses. And frankly, I'm just interested in what's effective. And I think most of us, when we're time pressed, we're resource pressed, we need things that are going to work. And cognitive and behavioral strategies are not the most effective when we're talking about stress responses, because we are in some ways, these defense responses don't care too much what we think. They will hijack us because it's about survival. And so I find if we can go deeper to that level, I have found it to be much more effective in working with organizations in crisis, organizations working with clients and patients also in crisis. It's about moving, extending. It's not saying not emotional PPE, but can we make it holistic PPE, right? Can we get to this idea of that the body is included? Because if we don't, it's really at our own peril. And I see Rita has a question here. Can you talk more about the movement of stress through the body to the brain and how we can contain and support staff who want to retell the stories of trauma exposure over and over? I think it's about, I have several thoughts here. On an interpersonal level, one thing a technique that I use is when someone's telling something, and I will just say, hey, I can pause. If I have a relationship with them, they're a colleague, I can pause and I can say, hey, I can see this story that you're telling really needs to be told. It's really important. I'm also seeing as you're telling this story that you're becoming pretty stressed out. Can we take a break for a moment? Just something like that, right? Just to acknowledge the level of stress in the telling starts to shift the culture a bit. The conversation about the movement of stress through the body to the brain, it's just the classic example I will give. If you're walking down the street and you see a car driving, and the person's on the phone, they're not seeing you, you are already jumping, right? You are jumping and moving away before you often realize that you're afraid. That the fear, you become fearful after. You had to move so quickly. So that's just an example of why these survival responses have to be so quick and be body first. Thoughts are just too slow, and our thoughts are like, what just happened there? And then we reconstruct it afterwards. There's the narrative. So hopefully that helps. Okay, hopefully that helps, Rita. So this idea, let me just make sure I'm hitting all my notes here, because I really want to, holistic PPE. So we're bringing the body into the equation. So self-regulatory skills are really important to still develop, and they can be developed not just in preparation, but they can be developed during the response phase. I am almost hesitant to call, and Leora alluded to this, I'm hesitant to even call it dysregulation. Dysregulation, we know that prefix, DYS, dis, means dysfunctional. It means your regulation is inappropriate in the moment. We're in the middle of a pandemic. So for people to have a stress response is actually very regulated. It's regulated to the moment. The question that I ask over and over again as I work with healthcare workers and support workers in healthcare is to say it's not having a stress response. It's being able to appraise, is my stress response adaptive in the moment? So it's more this idea of match and mismatch, not regulation, not dysregulation, which has I think a negative pathologizing impulse there. So I just want to point out that when we can name, and Leora said this, and normalize, yeah, it's pretty normal to be stressed here, but then ask people, did you turn the dial too high, and how can we together drop it down? The last thing I want to really talk about here is in this sense of leadership with the little L, as Leora calls it. So this is our personal leadership, the ability to settle our own systems. Our nervous system states, our defense states are infectious. Alarm spreads, right? And so, and again, it spreads through our voice, it spreads through our expression, and humans even make alarm pheromones. We make pheromones that will alert the people in our vicinity that there is danger. So it is infectious. And so we can use the right words, this is right, we can have the right practices in or structures in our organization. All of it can look very good. But if our own nervous system states are in alarm, that is so old and so primal that it will hijack all of us. And so, again, ignoring the body at our peril. So it's an embodied approach to bring along, to support all of the practices and the procedures and the wise behavior and the responsiveness. It's a holistic way to look at it. I want to address this last question, and I know we're coming up here to the end. And Todd, you have any suggestions as we had just started working toward trauma-informed school and as an LCSW to start counseling and creating social-emotional learning, toxic stress-focused curriculum? The district wants to get a strong program up and running. Culture of poverty, trauma, community before COVID. You know,
and Ken, this is Leora.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Well, I just wanted to offer that. Oh, good. Okay. And then I had go for it. Yeah.
Super quick, and this applies to anybody around. Becoming trauma-informed is a culture change. And we do that. I do that work as a consultant as well. And truthfully, in the middle of crisis it's very difficult to shift to the openness that's needed for culture change. And so it's more of a response model right now, and then you can bookmark some of these things for later, but what you can do is model the trauma-informed principles in your response. So that's my quick answer there.
Thank you. That is beautiful. Yeah, and that's for all of us. I'm going to stay, if we can both stay off mute, and Kem in the last couple minutes. I wanted to offer for those of you, particularly who are school site leadership, that our contact information is at the end, and we do a whole other body of work around school mental health work. So I just wanted to reflect that, and I think that piece around going back to the trauma-informed principles that we visited at the very beginning is a really important gift to both think about what lands for us and also what we could also contextualize for our own communities and our own context. And thank you, Nkem, for naming that the trauma-informed work that this conversation is nested in is really big work, and part about even embodying a trauma-informed practice is thinking about, is this the right time for what kind of work? And being really elegant with our next steps, really elegant with our choices, and intentional with our choices as we move through the next pieces. So I wanted to name, Nkem, that we've got about 2 more minutes before we move into closing. And are you hearing any feedback on your end, Nkem? I think I'm hearing feedback.
I am not hearing any feedback.
Oh, great. Okay. Then good. Then let's continue. So I just wanted to offer maybe one question, Nkem, after this whole conversation today and our last conversation. If there might be one offering, kind of one takeaway that you wanted to gift folks in the conversation today. I know that's a big whammy question, but kind of one sentence that's like staying pretty present with you that you wanted to offer folks as we transition.
The biggest thing I would say is bring your body along with. It's a resource there. It's a signal. It provides really great information, and it's a resource to support you, a neglected resource.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So it's the brain, it's the body, it's our needs, it's our behavior that ties us into our closing as we think about well-being, if we think about emotional or holistic PPE. It ties into our work as we kind of create a metaphorical buttoned up of these 2 sessions together with CPCA. Nkem and I will stay on like we did last time. We'll stay on for about 5 minutes after to see if there are any concrete questions in the chat box. But I wanted to resource, in addition to the resources that you already have in yourselves, in your bodies, and in your own wisdom, I wanted to offer a couple other resources. So we created a emotional PPE resource page. So this might be where, if you're really interested in this conversation, where you might spend some more time. So there's both articles and videos and websites and tools, depending on how you best learn in this moment and always. I'm also going to name, in the same way that in the same resources from last time, that there are some leadership resources, and you'll see that there's a particularly tomorrow there is a virtual counsel circle for essential workers. It's free, provided for the Center for Counsel. So if any of you identify as an essential worker, I really wanted to highlight that and recommend that for you. And then, of course, the organizations to whom we refer our learning. And Nkem, I wanted to see if you might offer 30 seconds of what Lumos transforms, what your organization is offering in this moment.
So we are doing daily workshops, online workshops, and we have been since March 13th, that are just quick 45-minute workshops to help people get a framework to think about their stress, including the body, and quick ways to settle, to have a more adaptive stress response. And those are open to the public, and any organization is welcome to send their staff, and have been a lot. So you can find those at our website, Lumos Transforms. They're called Anchoring Resilience for Turbulent Times, are those sessions.
And lastly, this is our contact information. This is our contact information. You can email us, access us on all the Twitters and the Instas and the Facebooks, and also sign up for our newsletter. We're really grateful to have been with you in this moment, and also partner continuously with CPCA, the California Primary Care Association, and Lumos Transforms. I'm going to offer you again, as you close out, if you might, in the questions box, provide one takeaway, one exactly like Jane and Renata just did, one takeaway, one piece that you're feeling really connected with, one learning that you landed on, or even a feeling in your body that you are experiencing that might be different or similar to how you started off. So I'm just going to invite you, one aha or takeaway And again, the slides will be sent out afterwards, as well as a survey that we're really hoping you take because it helps us continue this no-cost funding. So I know that many of you need to close out, and I welcome you to do that if that's what your day involves, but I am going to invite you to put in the question box one word that kind of encapsulates what you're feeling or thinking about right now, or a sentence, and we will stay on for about 5 minutes afterwards for questions. So I know you can't see them, so I'm going to read out self-care versus collective care, and Jane, we would even edit that one step further and say self-care and collective care. Naomi is feeling the takeaway of staying present in the body. Nkem, thank you for offering that. Magdalena is saying, I checked my body for the first time in 11 weeks and I'm honoring my tears. Yes, thank you, Magdalena. My teacher used to say that tears are the highest form of prayer. So thank you for naming that. Claudia said the word that is coming up is achievement. And Leah or Leah, however you pronounce your name, is offering collaboration and self-work is always needed. Lisa's feeling hopeful for the future. Maria is saying that Maria's takeaway is to take in consideration all the stages and the personal experiences of each stage. Thank you for the resources. And Ashley is feeling connected for the first time in a long time. We are too, Ashley. And Kim, I don't know if you wanted to keep reading them out. I can continue to do that too.
No, I'm good there. Michelle, I'm aware of my body and hopeful and thankful. It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Adrian, feeling more centered today. I learned that I do not need to relive the most traumatic of my experiences. Thank you so much. Yes, the worst part should be in our past. Renata, lots of tools that I can use at home right now. Thank you. Claudia, also contentment. That feels good. Maria, heart. Right back at you. Right back at you. What a pleasure. Thank you all for your warm words. May you all stay as safe and well as possible.
All right. Well, more. Keep going.
Mm-hmm. I like the concept of hot-low, Tom. Hot-low and high-impact disclosure. It will be a helpful tool. Thank you for the presentation. Jane, take care all. Likewise. All right, Todd, thank you. All right, Leora, what do you think?
I think we are going to close out and say again thank you to Allie and Charlotte, and ask Allie and Charlotte if you need to say anything before we close out, and otherwise just again sit in a lot of appreciation and awareness for the courage that many of you are holding in this moment now and always. So Allie and Charlotte, anything else you need from us before we close?
Nothing really on my end. When you do close today's platform, there is a brief CPCA survey. It's about 3 to 4 questions. If you could fill that out. Other than that, everyone have a wonderful Tuesday and a wonderful week.
Yes. All right. As Dulce says, we have the power to heal both collectively and individually. Absolutely. We're going to end on that note because that is the note to end on. We will be in community and in connection soon. Thank you so much. And again, gratitude to Nkem and Allie and Charlotte. Be well, everyone.